Okay, so graphing a market is tricky for all students when they're approaching this for the first time. And so I wanted to go over some more analysis on how to graph a market. So the very first thing you need to do is check out the video as to why when we present functions for supply and demand in the Q equals form, they are not in that y equals mx plus b form that you need in order to graph. So the goal is to get these in that y equal to mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. And that's because the way we graph price on the y-axis and q on the x-axis. And so how do you begin? Well, the very first step is really and always to make sure that you're using these graphical forms. And so to do that, your goal, you just kind of put this in a table format. This is, of course, supply, because there's a positive relationship between price and quantity. So I'm going to remind myself of that. This is demand, because there's a negative relationship between price and quantity. And so what happens here is that you essentially are just getting P on one side and everything else on the other. So here what you can see is I basically just subtracted 10, and then I multiplied by -2 to get rid of the 1/2. And so I get -2 times Q. I distribute the -2, and then -2 times -10 gets me that +20. I like to rearrange it, so I always start with where my y-intercept is, and then I go into my slope. And I'm going to remind myself again that I'm working in the demand function here, so it should start at a higher point than my supply function. So if I go right over here, I'm doing the same thing where I'm just getting P on one side and everything else on the other. So I get 1/2. So first of all, I just subtracted 4, then I divide by 2. And what I get is, remember there's an implied 1 in front of this Q, so I get 1/2 times Q minus 2. Again, I like to start my functions with where it starts on the y-intercept and then move on to slope. And so now I have a supply and demand function, and so my supply function starts at -2. And it has a slope of up 1 over 2, up 1 over 2. And I don't want to graph it until I compare it to my slope of the demand function, which is 2. So that's down 2 over 1, down 2 over 1, and it starts at 20, okay? So down 2 over 1, that's pretty steep. So that's a demand function that's relatively more steep compared to a supply function that's relatively flatter. Now in economics, we really like to it's relative slopes compared to each other rather than absolute slopes. So it's really important to exaggerate those differences rather than trying to draw this to some sort of scale. And so as a result, you have an analysis where probably these producers have a lot more options in the marketplace than the consumers. So they can just take their production materials and probably produce something slightly different if this marketplace isn't so great. So compared to consumers who, it looks like in this analysis, have a lot fewer options. So this is something that there aren't a lot of available substitutes for in the marketplace. And so when we add, so we're going to start in free market conditions at the intersection of supply and demand, P star and Q star. When we add a tax, what of course it does is it reduces the amount traded in the marketplace. So I'm going to take that wall and I'm going to push it in. We use the wedge method to show that now there's not just one price, but there are two prices. The sticker price that the consumers, let me just switch sides here, pay is much higher than the amount that the producers get. So if this is, a jug of milk, you have that sticker price. That's what goes to the dairy producers. And then you have the amount you pay the cashier, and that's the sticker price plus the tax. So the difference is that tax. And so the question is, who bears the burden of this marketplace? And what you can see here, or the burden of this tax rather, in this marketplace, what you can see here is that actually, as predicted, consumers have a much higher portion of the tax in purple than, I don't know, I'm running out of color, so I'm going to do green. That's the amount that the producers pay out of the tax. And so that happens because this relative slopes. Remember, the consumers have a lot fewer options compared to the producers, and so the burden of the tax is pushed more onto the consumers as a result. So that helps you in another way see both how to graph and how the burden of the tax is split between these two different parties. And so you can see it looks like something like 2/3 of the tax is paid by consumers, and just 1/3 of the tax is paid by producers. And that sharing of the tax has to add up exactly to 100% of the tax. So hopefully that is another way for you to practice graphing.